Hi, thanks, Stuart. I'm up next, and I'm going to be talking about FME's exceptional null handling, which was something that we did new in FME 2014. So let me just start up my slideshow here. And off we go. So we're going to be talking much more about things that have been happened to the desktop product. And so one of the major enhancements to FME 2014 was the fact that we added real null support and null handling right throughout the product. So there was lots of great one-liners when it came to this kind of work, and one of them that was thrown around quite a lot was the old much ado about nothing. Basically, we had about 15 different ways that we were representing nothing within the product and within the various formats that FME worked with. And so one of the common ones was to use value-based no data values. This is where we're using things like for raster handling, for instance, a no data value tends to be that triplet, an RGB 000, or for a digital elevation model, we might use a value of -32,758 or something along those lines. Anyone that's ever written to MapInfo and has sent the MapInfo writer a numeric field with no data in it would have ended up with a value like -9999 in their data. And that was another example of a value-based no data value. Some of the many formats actually worked with nulls and ended up having them as missing attributes. So, for example, CSV was one of the most common of these. If you read in a CSV file and there was a column in the CSV file that had nothing in it, then that attribute would come in with that feature would come in with a missing attribute. So sometimes when you read a CSV file, you would get 10 features coming in. The first feature would have 10 attributes on it. The second feature would come in, it only had about 6 attributes on it. And that's because those attributes that were missing had null values in them. Sometimes we looked at null values as empty fields, but an empty field also isn't really a null field. Empty has an ASCII value. It's a valid, might be a single blank, might be a number of blank fields. It showed up as empty within FME. And so the only really true null values were those that were in your SQL compliant databases, where null really was representing an unknown value. And so that has an ASCII sort of hex value of 0. It's the bottom basic null value. So in 2013, we used to deal with nulls as missing attributes, which caused a number of different conflicts as we were working with data throughout the product. So in 2014, we went to a lot of effort. It was a lot of effort because it involved us touching most of the formats and most of the transformers so that we could provide full null support throughout the entire product. So why did we bother doing this? Well, it was very meaningful to our database customers. It correctly identified that an attribute was null, and that's more than correct than just assuming that the attribute is missing or has an empty value in it. It also meant that when we were dealing with data and round-tripping data, we would actually take null data and end up with null data, which wasn't something that we were doing before. And so really it was a very core issue that needed to be solved, and it's been solved in 2014. So why do you care about that? Well, a number of changes were made alongside adding null support that will possibly provide impact to everybody that uses the product. And again, if you're round-tripping data, it means that you actually are getting the right data from your source data. So first up, one of the places that we made a change was in the data inspector. So now the data inspector really shows what is in your attributes. Are they null values? Are they missing values? Or are they empty strings? And this means that in the table viewer, you can see here, there's an example. This data here must have come from something like MapInfo or CSV, so that the value shows up as missing. Whereas this data here came from a database, and so here it's actually showing us that we've got nulls in it. Similarly, we made changes to the logger transformer, and so this same representation shows up in your logger. And I'll just show you a quick example of that. So here I have some data sitting in a PostGIS database, which actually happens to be a PostGIS database that's sitting on one of our cloud machines. And I'm going to read that data in. And I'm going to display it both in a data inspector and also in a logger within the workbench. So here come my parks. And if I click on a big park like this, you can see that this is Stanley Park in Vancouver, British Columbia. And if we scroll down, you'll see that within that particular record, I've received some attributes that have been assigned null values. You also see them down here in the table list at the bottom. In FME 2013, those attributes here would just be missing from this particular feature, and down here they have shown with blank values, which is really meaningless. You don't know if they were there or not. You'll also notice that I've got a couple of attributes over here that are missing. Those are genuinely missing from this data and haven't been read in. Because they didn't hold null values in them, they just held something other than null that caused it to be read in as a missing attribute. In addition, we'll see that within the log file, if we just scroll up here a little ways, we'll see that in the log we're also identifying these attributes as having null values. So what did we have to change? We had to change just about every reader and writer. Readers were the more difficult of the two because writers in particular, many of the database writers used to write nulls out correctly, and that was because once FME had handed the feature over to the actual Oracle writer, it would take that data that was coming into it and would actually write nulls out as into the Oracle. But when we read them in was where we were having the biggest difficulty, and so now all of our major readers actually read in null values correctly. So this includes the database ones such as Oracle, SQL Server, and also many of the ones that you might not consider to be quite so databasey, CSV or Access. So these will now read those null attributes in and have them as data on your features. What we did do in the writers, which we're now able to update write our null values, we actually now are able to update to null. This was something we couldn't do before. We couldn't take a field that was in the database and replace it with a null value, and now we're able to do that. Also, many of our transformers, our creator transformers, can now make null values for you. So for instance, if you want to add a new attribute to a feature and we want to assign that attribute the value of null, both the attribute creator and the attribute value mapper will do that kind of thing. So again, let's just take a quick look at what that looks like. I'll open up another workspace here. Setting null values. Well, that's a bit sad. I must have used this in 2015, so let's just go and take a look over there. So 2015, we've already got a beta version out of that, and it also, of course, supports the nulls. And I should have shut that one down. So here we go. So an attribute creator, we can assign a new attribute here called golf course, for instance, and we can assign it a null value. So that means when it comes in from our database, we've got database data here, we've created a new attribute and given it a good value. And then our attribute value mapper here, we can do things like we can map. If that golf course has still got a null value, then I want to assign it a destination value of 0 on another attribute that's related to this one. Whereas if the golf course has a valid value, then I want to assign it a different destination value. And so we can run this workspace and see what it looks like in the table viewer. So not only the attribute creator and the attribute value mapper allow us to do that kind of thing, but there is null support in most of the other transformers as well. So take a look here. Our golf course has a value of null in many of the columns, which is mapped to a greens fee of 0. Sometimes it had a value of yes, and so we have mapped it to a greens fee with a particular dollar value. Some of the other transformers that we worked on, once we started to realize that we were going to have nulls flowing through our workspace, we might have needed to map the nulls to different values. So we put in a new transformer called the null attribute mapper. This replaced the older transformer that has been out there for some time called the null attribute replacer. All that could do was take a null value and replace it with something. The null attribute mapper is much more powerful than that, and so that allows you to change null values into a particular value, and it also allows you to change data values into nulls. It also allowed you to get around a bit of a compatibility issue. If you really wanted those nulls to be handled as missing values, then you could use the null attribute mapper to set nulls back to the old missing values. Now, the nice thing about the null attribute mapper was that it allowed you to work on a selection of attributes. So you can see in the example here, it had selected attributes here that I could work with. And it turned out to be so useful that we ended up aliasing the null attribute mapper to the bulk attribute mapper, because it did so much more than just mapping nulls. So if we take a look at what that looks like in a workspace, we can see how that particular transformer works and its various options. So this is what a null attribute mapper looks like. So we happen to have some park reference IDs out there, and if that attribute value is -9999, then we'd like to map it through to a null value, and the null attribute mapper allows us to do it. We can either use selected attributes, or we could actually choose to have that apply to all attributes if there was something along the lines we wanted to do. In addition, we can also do things like map this particular value has nulls in it, and we'd like to give it a new value of a proper URL that points to a particular park, and so we can do that kind of thing as well. So the null attribute mapper is very powerful and allows you to do those kind of things. The final transformer that this made a big difference to, so if we take a look, we've got ref IDs which have actually got nulls in them now, whereas before they probably had -9999s. And we also have park URLs that have got valid values in them. So similar to the null attribute mapper, one of the big enhancements was made to the SQL creator. Sorry, I need to open my workspace. And the SQL executor. And those of you who have worked with these at all may remember that the SQL creator and the SQL executor allow you to populate this list of attributes that you want to expose based on the SQL statement that you've got built into the transformer. So here my SQL statement looks like this. I want to select park ID, park name, and park URL. And I want to expose those attributes into my workspace. The issue was that in 2013, when it went to use that SQL statement, if any of these attributes had nulls in them, then those attributes wouldn't be exposed here in this list. And in many cases, that could be quite a long list of attributes that had null values. And so it was very tedious to have to manually put these attributes in here. So that was another major enhancement to those particular transformers that make them much easier to work with. Another thing we had to do within all the transformers was, once you've got nulls, then you want to know whether or not an attribute value has got a null in it. And so we had to change things like the attribute classifier, so that you could pick from the list of tests that you could test whether or not the attribute had nulls. And we also had to fix the tester, so that the tester would actually test to see whether or not an attribute is null. And so again, in that drop-down list of tests within the tester, there's now a test that says attribute is null. And again, that will work with any data that's coming in. And if it doesn't have a null in it, you can also test for attribute is missing. So there's a variety of goodness there within the tester. So stay up to date with what we're doing on About Nothing. The FMEpedia site has got a couple of useful articles on it. The one in particular is this one here, which I may be able to get to come up, where we're talking about how we're handling that attribute values. And so we're constantly updating this page as we do more work on FME and null handling. So we tell you the different things that are around. There's a few known issues that are important for you to know about. And then it talks about what we used to do, just in case you're still working with an older version of FME. In addition, as we continue this work, we're still solving additional problems. And one of them is that in the attribute expression evaluator, we were changing null values back to empty strings. But in FME 2015, in that beta, that's now being worked on and has been resolved. So keep up to date. And then the other link here is to the FME Evangelist, where we've written an article about our null support. So definitely get back to us if you're having any issues around nulls, or if you can see a spot where we need to do more about our null handling, and you can contact us at info@sec.com and let us know. Thanks very much.